The frozen wasteland stretched endlessly before them, a barren expanse of snow and ice illuminated by the pale glow of a full moon. Mara Chase trudged forward, her boots crunching against the frost, the biting Arctic wind cutting through her layers. The others followed in silence, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Behind them, the trail they had carved through the snow was already vanishing under the relentless drift. Ahead, the Prometheus lab loomed like a monolithic shadow against the icy landscape. Its entrance, a jagged tear in the ice, yawned wide, as if the earth itself had swallowed the structure. Once the cutting edge of genetic research, the facility now lay abandoned, a tomb for the horrors it had unleashed. Raoul tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his shoulder. "Are we sure about this?" he muttered, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "This place looks like a damn graveyard." "It is," Mara replied, her eyes fixed on the dark opening ahead. "But it's the only place that might have answers." Sophia, walking just behind them, let out a shaky breath. "And what if it doesn't?" Mara didn't respond. She couldn't afford to entertain that thought. If there were any chance of stopping the revenants, any chance of reversing what humanity had unleashed, it would be here, in the heart of the nightmare. The entrance was littered with debris, twisted metal, shattered glass, and the frozen remains of what had once been Prometheus personnel. The corpses were unrecognizable, their bodies warped and mangled. Ice crystals clung to their flesh, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Mara stepped over a severed limb, her stomach churning as she forced herself to focus. Inside, the air was thick and stagnant, heavy with the stench of decay. The dim glow of emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced like phantoms. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the darkness. The deeper they ventured, the worse it became. The walls were slick with a strange organic substance, a translucent film that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Tendrils of the material snaked along the floor and ceiling, spreading like veins through the facility. Mara knelt to examine one, her gloved fingers brushing against its surface. It was warm to the touch. "This wasn't here before," she said, her voice hushed. Raoul stared at the walls, his expression grim. "It's like the whole place is growing." "It's a nest," Jared said, his voice trembling. The boy had been silent for most of the journey, but now his fear was palpable. "They're turning it into a nest." Sophia's flashlight illuminated something further ahead, and she froze. "Oh my God," she whispered. Mara followed her gaze and felt her breath catch. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its walls and ceiling completely overtaken by the organic growth. Hundreds of cocoon-like structures lined the space, their translucent membranes pulsating with a sickly green glow. Inside, humanoid shapes twitched and writhed, their features distorted beyond recognition. "They're incubating," Mara said, her voice barely audible. She stepped closer, her flashlight revealing the horrifying details. The creatures inside the cocoons were in various stages of transformation. Human faces twisted into elongated, alien visages. Limbs stretched and contorted, spines arched grotesquely. Some had already begun to emerge, their claws tearing through the membranes as they thrashed against their restraints. "This isn't just a nest," Raoul said, his voice tight with dread. "It's a factory." The sound of movement echoed through the chamber, low and guttural. The group froze, their flashlights darting across the shadows. From the far end of the chamber, something massive stirred. The tendrils along the walls seemed to react, pulsating faster as if in anticipation. Then they saw it. The prime revenant emerged from the shadows, its towering form an amalgamation of human and alien features. Its skin was a mottled blend of pale flesh and chitinous plates, its limbs elongated and ending in razor-sharp claws. Rows of glowing green eyes lined its distorted face, each one moving independently as it surveyed the intruders. It let out a low, guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The cocoons around it began to tremble, their inhabitants thrashing more violently. The prime revenant stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. Mara felt terror grip her, but she forced herself to move. "Back! Now!" she shouted, grabbing Jared by the arm and pulling him toward the corridor. The prime revenant lunged, its claws striking the ground where they had stood moments earlier. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber, and several of the cocoons burst open, spilling their grotesque contents onto the floor. Newly transformed revenants scrambled to their feet, their movements erratic but unnervingly fast. The group ran, their footsteps echoing through the corridors as the creatures pursued them. Mara's heart pounded as she led them through the labyrinthine facility, her mind racing. The prime revenant wasn't just a mutation, it was the hive's core, the source of the nest's growth and the key to stopping the spread. They found temporary refuge in a sealed laboratory. The room was a mess of overturned equipment and shattered glass, but the reinforced door held firm against the revenants pounding on the other side. Mara frantically searched the consoles for data, her fingers flying across the keys. Come on," she muttered, her breath coming in short gasps. "What are you looking for?" Sophia asked, her voice shaking. "Anything we can use," Mara replied. She pulled up a file labeled Proto-Gene 7, Core Analysis, and scanned the contents. Her stomach sank as she read the data. The genetic sequence wasn't just a mutation. It was a reawakening of ancient, alien DNA embedded deep in humanity's genome. The prime revenant was the culmination of this evolution, the apex predator that the dormant genes had been waiting to create. "We have to kill it," Mara said, turning to the others. "The prime revenant is the source. If we destroy it, we destroy the nest." "And how exactly do we do that?" Raoul asked, gesturing toward the door, where the pounding had grown more intense. "We barely got out alive." Mara's eyes fell on a schematic displayed on the console. A large containment unit in the facility's lower levels had been repurposed into a power reactor. If overloaded, it could generate an explosion strong enough to obliterate the nest. She looked at the group, her jaw set with determination. "We overload the reactor." Sophia's eyes widened. "That'll kill us too." Mara nodded grimly. "It's either us or them." The reactor chamber was a cathedral of steel and ice, its towering walls lined with conduits that pulsed faintly with green light. The hum of machinery filled the air, a deep rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate in Mara's chest as she stepped into the cavernous room. Her breath clouded the air, and she could see her reflection in the glossy surface of the reactor core, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. Behind her, Raoul and Sophia entered cautiously, their weapons raised. Jared lingered by the door, his trembling hands clutching the detonator they had cobbled together from scavenged equipment. None of them spoke. The enormity of what they were about to do weighed heavily in the frigid silence. Mara turned to the group. "We need to overload the reactor manually. Once the sequence is started, there's no going back." Raoul nodded grimly, his face set like stone. "Let's end this." The Prime Revenant arrived before they could begin. It burst into the chamber with a deafening roar, its massive frame shattering the doorway as it clawed its way inside. Green light poured from its many eyes, illuminating its grotesque form. The creature's elongated limbs twitched with anticipation, its claws dripping with black ichor. Around it, lesser revenants skittered into the room, their movements erratic and insect-like. Mara barely had time to react before the first revenant lunged at her. She ducked, her knife flashing as she drove it into the creature's throat. Black ichor sprayed across her face, burning like acid. Raoul opened fire, his rifle's muzzle flashing as bullets tore into the Prime Revenant's armored hide. The creature let out a guttural snarl, unfazed, and swept its massive claw across the room. Raoul was thrown against the wall with a sickening crunch. "Raoul!" Sophia screamed, running to his side. Mara didn't look back. She couldn't. Every fiber of her being was focused on the reactor. She sprinted toward the control panel, her fingers trembling as she began to input the overload sequence. Behind her, the sounds of battle raged. Sophia's desperate shouts, Jared's panicked sobs, the unrelenting screeches of the revenants. The Prime Revenant turned its many eyes toward her, sensing her intent. It roared, its claws carving deep grooves into the steel floor as it barreled toward the reactor. Mara's heart raced as she frantically typed the final command. "Come on," she muttered under her breath. "Come on." The reactor's core began to glow brighter, its hum growing into a high-pitched whine. The overload sequence had started. Sophia let out a blood-curdling scream as a revenant pinned her to the ground. Mara turned just in time to see the creature tear into her, its claws ripping through flesh and bone. Sophia's eyes met Mara's for a brief, agonizing moment before the light in them faded. Jared stood frozen by the door, the detonator clutched tightly in his hands. Tears streamed down his face as he watched Sophia fall, his body trembling with fear. "Jared!" Mara shouted, her voice breaking. "Get out of here! Now!" He didn't move. The boy's wide, terrified eyes locked onto the Prime Revenant as it closed the distance to Mara. She grabbed a pipe from the ground, brandishing it like a spear. It was a futile gesture, but she had no intention of letting the creature stop her now. The Revenant lunged, and Mara swung the pipe with all her strength. It glanced off the creature's armored hide, doing little more than earning its rage. The Prime Revenant's claws slashed downward, and Mara barely rolled out of the way. Pain shot through her leg as one of its claws grazed her, tearing through flesh. The reactor core was glowing brighter now, its light filling the chamber. The tendrils lining the walls began to writhe, reacting to the growing energy. The nest was alive, and it knew it was under threat. Mara crawled toward the detonator, her leg trailing blood across the floor. Jared was still standing there, paralyzed with fear. She reached out, her bloodied hand gripping his arm. "Jared," she gasped, her voice urgent. "You have to leave. Get out of here. You're the only one who can make it." He shook his head violently, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I can't. Mara, I can't leave you." "You have to," she shouted, her voice cracking. "If you don't, this was all for nothing. Go." For a moment he hesitated. Then, with a sob, he nodded and turned, running through the shattered doorway and into the darkness beyond. Mara felt a cold sense of relief wash over her as she watched him disappear. She turned back to the reactor, the prime revenant towering over her now. Its glowing eyes burned with malevolence as it raised its claw for the final strike. With a grim smile, Mara grabbed the detonator. "You lose," she whispered, pressing the button. The explosion ripped through the facility with the force of a small sun. The reactor core detonated in a blinding flash of light, vaporizing everything within its radius. The organic tendrils shriveled and burned, the cocoons bursting into flames as the energy consumed the nest. The prime revenant let out an ear-piercing screech as its body disintegrated, its glowing eyes fading to black. Mara felt nothing as the light enveloped her. Her last thought wasn't of the pain or the fear. It was of her daughter, Emma, her laughter echoing in her mind. Jared stumbled through the snow, the shock wave of the explosion knocking him to the ground. He turned back to see the Prometheus facility collapsing in on itself, a fiery inferno consuming the nest. The light of the explosion lit up the night sky, visible for miles. He fell to his knees, tears freezing on his cheeks. Mara was gone. They all were. But the nest was destroyed, or so he thought. Weeks later, as Jared wandered through an abandoned town, he noticed something strange. Tiny glowing spores drifted through the air, settling on the snow. Animals moved strangely, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The mutation wasn't gone. It had adapted. As Jared looked to the horizon, he saw a pack of creatures moving in the distance, lean, fast, and deadly. They weren't revenants anymore. They were something worse. Mankind's fight for survival was far from over.